So I'll tell you a little bit about my talk today. It's going to be, I entitle it The Psychology of Collage. But I could also call it the aesthetics of memory or the aesthetics of identity. And I'll tell you just in one sentence, really my idea is that my collages, I believe, are a metaphor to understand more about memory and identity. So let's think about that for just a minute. And we'll move to the first slide. So did I do that? No. How do I move forward? Okay. All right, so this is an example of my work. And as you can see, there are lots of layers. The color saturation isn't amazing here, but in any case, you could see the layers and you can see other elements. So just for a minute, basically I would like, invite you to explore just the different elements that make up this particular image. Just allow your minds and your mind's eye rather to sort of trace any movement, any juxtapositions, any seams, anything about it. And I invite you to add a layer to that, and that over the course of the talk today, we're going to understand what I mean by collage as a metaphor for memory and identity. So we're going to do two things today. So before we start, we're going to do sort of a group exercise together. It's private, and then what I'm going to do is at various points throughout the talk, I'm going to open it up to people to spontaneously talk about their observations or other thoughts that come to mind. I find that actually when people start talking about it, I'll give you some cues, but when people start talking about it, they end up giving the whole talk for me, and then it makes it a lot easier for me. It's like a popcorn effect. So feel free, in the beginning I realize it's going to be just like when you put popcorn in the microwave, it's just a couple of pops, but I'm hoping that we're really going to pop by the end of this and that all of us are going to feel some connection to the topic. But before we start that, we're just going to start with a brief, what I call a grounding exercise. And I'm going to put on my therapist voice, and we're all going to basically go through this together, just a few minutes. So first what I want you to do is, or I invite you to do, is to put your both feet on the ground. And then with your eyes opened or closed, whatever, if your eyes remain open, just allow them to have a soft gaze before you. But if your eyes are closed, that's good too. It's optional. And we're going to do what's called a grounding exercise. So we're just going to start with the sensation of our feet in our shoes. And we're going to notice whether or not our feet are symmetrical, whether one foot is maybe turned in or turned out, what part of the foot is touching the floor. And we're going to notice sensations that maybe we haven't noticed before. We're going to say, oh, that's curious, I never noticed that before. Going to work our way up our legs to our knees. Maybe if our hands are touching our knees, we're going to feel the connection between our hands and our knees. Maybe our knees and the backs of the chairs. And we're going to move our way up backwards. We're going to feel our seat in the chair. We're going to notice whether or not it's symmetrical or not symmetrical. We're going to notice our chest wall, whether or not our breathing rate is rapid or shallow. Without judgment, we're just going to notice these things. An observation, looking inward, maybe noticing physical sensations that we haven't noticed before. Going to work our way up to our shoulders, the shoulder blades. Notice whether or not they're symmetrical on the back, where our back hits the chair, where our neck touches the top of our head. Maybe what the sound feels like. Does the sound feel different on one side versus the other? Do you feel any sensation of air movement? Just noticing. To the face, any parts of your face crinkled, any parts of your face relaxed, just noticing. Down the front of the body, back down the knees, to the tops of the feet, noticing our feet on the floor. So when you're ready, whenever that is, I invite you to come back to the room and open your eyes. Now hopefully everybody's in a relaxed state. They're going to like my jokes. And I'm just, so anyway, so what I would like you to do is to write down in the next 5 or 10 minutes, we're going to take 5 minutes, and I just want you to jot down relevant fragments about your life story in whatever order feels most organic, no need for complete sentences, spontaneous stream of consciousness. Just, it's an optional exercise, but whatever you, but I would, you know, we'll illustrate the relevance of this over time. Nobody's going to see this except for you, but just for a few minutes, we're going to, I guess Nancy, we discussed it, we'll stop the tape for a few minutes. People will just jot down whatever comes to mind organically about their life story, and then we'll come back. We're going to come back to that, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my life story after I've taken you through a whole journey about memory. So like I said before, that my collages are a metaphor for memory and identity. And in the last 20 years or so of being a psychiatrist and listening to many different stories, I calculated in my head that I've done about 24,000 psychotherapy sessions. So in hearing all of those stories over my career, I've thought a lot about memory. And so I'm going to share with you some of those observations that I've learned about memory, both clinically and what I've read and academically, and then of course through my art. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to be able to translate it in a way that people look at an image of mine, understand the concept, and then they sort of, I say they pause for the imagery, they stop for the conversation, and then they take it and they apply it in some way to their life in some shape, some form. So the first idea is that memories are made up of fragments. So memories are not fixed, assemblages that are like just permanently in our minds. What happens with a memory is they often get triggered by something, either by seeing something or hearing something or feeling something, and they come together in pieces. So if we think about basically like the idea, I'd say, all right, I want you to remember your birthday last year. You might bring the pieces together. You'd say, where was I? Who was there? What was the feeling like? What did I, what was my cake like? You put it together in pieces and fragments. So memories are not actually just photographs, but they're actually pieces of photographs all put together. So memories are temporary constructs. So they're not permanent. What happens with memory is that it sort of consolidates and crystallizes, and then it disappears, and then it comes together, and it disappears, and it comes together, and it disappears. So you can see already the idea that they're coming together, disappearing. So how often do you think a memory comes together the same way? Right? Very rarely. If it's coming apart and coming together, coming apart, coming together, it's going to arrange itself in multiple different ways. So that's the idea that memories are dynamic, that they're constantly changing. So here's an example of one way one of my pieces comes together. Some of my pieces are like maybe 150 pieces. They come together over like a 3 to 9 month period. They take a long time. I say they're like people. They need to sort of mature and this might be like a beginning. So I think of, sort of I have a crystallization of a image in my mind, and then I find the pieces, just like when I described how we put together a memory of our birthdays. I put together the pieces, it looks like that, and then finally like 9 months later it looks like that. So I invite anybody to think of any associations, if you've had psychology courses, if you had any observations, any comments so far.
The dog is different.
The dog is different. Yes.
Why?
That's a good point. It wasn't the right dog for the scene, and I think that's a really good point, is that basically is that similar to our memories, the dog could be different, right? In fact, we could remember something where we say, oh no, that dog passed away like 5 years before that. But we bring them into the scene, into the memory, because memories become condensed on top of each other. And we're going to get into that idea. But the idea here is that you could have the same memory with 2 different dogs.
But it's not only different, but it's in a different position, doing a different action.
And doing a different action.
The first one is relaxing, now maybe playing.
Very good observation. Excellent observation. So basically, so we put together scenes also based on the way that we feel, right? So basically, we might put together a scene, if this is an adventure scene, I think of this as like a Field and Stream 1935, but like sort of like I think of it as like a fashion edition, like she's out, fishing in her whatever, in her Hermes dress, but that I made, by the way. Somebody said, "Oh, you made that dress? It's so beautiful." I said, "Yeah, I'm going to be a fashion designer." So anyway, but the point is that the image sometimes fits the feeling. In other words, the memory fits the feeling. So sometimes we wedge things into our memories that are actually more consistent with the feeling state that we had than with actually what occurred. In fact, that probably happens more of the time. So the way that you remember it is that that dog was also looking in that, was looking forward to that journey. Now, people might say, no, memories are not like that. Well, this is an artistic representation of what I think memories look at, but this is based on, maybe, I don't know, 50,000 hours of observation. So quite a bit. So I have an idea which I call the optics of memory. In other words, what do memories look like? At least what is my interpretation of what memories look like? So, and again, I use my collage as a way of basically of showing a visual depiction of what I think memory looks like. So memories follow a spatial logic that feels realistic. People know what I mean by that? Anybody? In other words, that the spatial orientation or the spatial logic of the memory, it feels realistic, but if you think about it, it really isn't realistic. In other words, it's not that it's like a fun house, but it's somewhere between what you're seeing now and a fun house, because it doesn't follow the same spatial representations. And as I show you some more of my work, you'll see what I mean by that. Another one is that memories seem almost like they have no seams between them. But then again, when we look at a memory from afar, it looks like it's this cohesive thing, just like one of my collages. When you look closely at it, you say, "Oh, that didn't actually go there," or that I sort of layered on top of that. So people are getting the idea, right? Memories overlap. So one memory can overlap another memory, and then the other memory can sort of you can peer through it or pierce that other memory. That memories have a perspective. In other words, when we look at a memory, there's a perspective. Most people look at a memory, they don't see themselves in the memory, but they see like as if, sort of a virtual reality idea. Sometimes they see themselves, but I would say also they have a perspective in terms of some people have like a value judgment that they place on a memory, or they have some sort of a perspective. And the perspective that you view the memory with has really a lot of impact on what you see. And then memories can be navigated. So a memory is not a fixed, I say that it's like a collage, but it's like a collage that can be navigated. In other words, basically it's not a video per se, but it can be turned into a video. You can navigate sort of the nooks and crannies of your memory. So this I call basically, this is called the dollhouse. And basically what I say is that this is the representation of what it feels like to be a psychiatrist and look at somebody's story. What does that mean, right? So I have this idea that basically that this woman is the person who's coming in to talk to me, and she tells me about her life, and she tells me about her husband, she tells me about her dog, his cat. Look at the positioning of the dog. The dog has its own place on the chair, right? Basically, she tells me about her son, his wife, their dog, and then she tells me about her other son. So this is like a story that I've heard many times. So I say basically, so notice that I say that it's navigable. In other words, basically you can go down here, and when somebody is basically, like to keep track of so many stories, I had to have these sort of visual representations of what the stories look like, right? So I had people say, they say, "Oh, Dr. Rudin, you must take really good notes." I said, "Well, no, actually, I just have sort of like a photographic memory. I can sort of just see what your story looks like. I have an image of what your apartment looks like. I could even like sort of navigate all the nooks and crannies of your apartment. I can see your son, on the couch, and I can see basically them arrive. So I have these visual, and I basically say so I see the collage of your life." And it has layer. People say, "Oh, I love how you mix the old and the new at the same time." I say, well, the old and the new at the same time is the new, because in the new is the old. So that's why I represent, and I say that the old can go back, hundreds of years. There are parts of us that basically that, parts of speech or, certain stories that have been passed down in generations of our family, even maybe our genes are tagged in such a way that basically that it represents the old and the new at the same time. All right, so now I'm really going to challenge you guys to open it up. Does anybody have any observations, any thoughts, anything? Yes?
Why do you choose images that seem idealistic? The scene here, the decor and the way people are dressed are very beautiful and very arranged as opposed to dirty or disturbing or gritty.
Okay, that's a really good question. And I've thought a lot about that question. I sort of analyzed myself, and so I have these hypotheses about that. So one of the hypotheses I have about that is that I've dealt a lot with, I've talked with a lot of people about memories that are really disturbing, right? And I basically have helped them to arrange the memory in such a way that it helps them to move forward and to feel optimistic and to feel that they can face things. In other words, one of my ideas is that it's, and I will get into this, is that it's not the parts in and of themselves, but the arrangement of the parts in relation to each other that tell the story. So in effect, you say, oh, you're using all these opulent images, but these all came from the garbage. These all came from the recycling. So basically people would say, oh, there's nothing there, you just take it. And that's what they did do. That's how I got all my materials. People thought, oh, this is just garbage, I'm just going to throw it out. And I went to the recycling and I picked it up. So basically what I'm saying is you can sort of make something out of, so I'm making these beautiful things out of something that maybe somebody else wouldn't be able to imagine, as maybe an analogy that you can make. It's not that you're going to make a beautiful, idyllic memory out of something that's not beautiful and idyllic, but you can rearrange it in such a way that helps you to feel better about it. Because what's the function of memory at the end of the day? The function of memory at the end of the day is to learn, right? And what's the function of learning? Well, the function of learning is to move forward and to be able to confront things, as they come up, to sort of help you feel strong. The purpose of memory is not to come out of it and say like, well, I'm a total failure and I shouldn't even try. You know what I mean? The purpose of the memory is like, I navigated that well. Yeah, I broke my leg, but I basically, so my idea is that basically is that I do make these stories out of, that are idyllic and beautiful. But I guess it's like what I'm saying is that there's like well, this sort of an image makes me feel optimistic and makes me feel, each time I try to make a collage, I try to sort of outdo myself. I say that that this is like emotional problem solving for me, like that I have to deal with like, is it gonna work? Is it gonna work? It's I go through this whole process, and by the time I get to the end of it, I'm happy with it. But each time I'm still like nail biting whether or not it's gonna happen. Any other? Yes?
Does your image, like when you're imagining how the artwork is going to look, does it change over time according to what you find, or do you keep looking until you find that exact thing that's in your head?
Wonderful question. So both. Okay, so on the one hand, basically, I say that I have to practice what I preach. Like I see these sitcoms and stuff like that about the psychiatrist, and then you show the psychiatrist's life and they're like a complete wreck. You know what I mean? Like they're not doing anything that they told their patients to do. So I basically, the reason I bring that up is because I say that I alternate between activity and passivity. So I do seek out the image. In other words, I get a crystallized sort of view of what I want the image to look for, and then I look for it and I say, oh, 2 years ago I saw I saw a set of stairs that I think would work there, and then I look for it. But I'm flexible enough that basically that if the world is telling me, Steve, no, those weren't stairs, those were clouds, I will do that. Memories are a mixture of optimistic and pessimistic features. The way that I've arranged this, you could say at first glance that it looks like, sort of like a beautiful scene. But when you look closer, you realize that it's a mixed bag. Now, if everybody in this room could accept that life is a mixed bag, we would all be better off for it. In other words, to realize that in everything beautiful, there's something that's not beautiful, that they coexist at the same time. But it doesn't mean that if there's something not beautiful in there, that it's not beautiful at all. Does that make sense? People following that? Now, the other point that I bring is what I call the optics, or sort of the aesthetics of memory, is that basically imagine if they were closer together. Imagine if when this woman was telling the story, the memory, she said, was having him sit here. Think about how different that story would be. So that's a really important point where I'm trying to demonstrate with collage, is that just a tiny shift, basically, of making him go from here to here tells a wholly different story. And the reality of the situation is that he might sit there more often. And I might, as a therapist, have to say to her, well, does he really never sit next to you? And she'll say, well, no, he never sits next to me when I want to talk. I'll say, oh, well, that's different. You know what I mean? So the collage might look different based on, so I think that's a really important point. And also basically like, so the way that somebody tells the story could be quite different by just modifying a small piece. And so one of the things that happens to me with the collage is that sometimes I'll add one element and it'll change the entire story. And I'll say to myself, well, that is an analogy for life. In other words, people think that they need to add these huge things. Like, in other words, if I just got a really good paying job and somebody who hung on every one of my words, no, if I just basically, if I were to have this thing that I think in my life that I need, that's this big black hole as far as I'm concerned, then my life would be good. When really they just need like a border, They just need something small that just changes the composition of everything else. Other thoughts? So here's just another example of basically like putting different parts together to tell a story. I'm a big lover of Barcelona. I lived in Spain when I was in college, and like a lot of my aesthetic sensibility comes from Spanish painting, Catholic painting to pretty much 20th century to Picasso. And so I value the idea of the composition, and this basically just evokes for me a feeling of a woman near the sea at a party. All right, so I'm not the first person to think about the mind in a visual way. I know that's a shocker, but basically, I'm standing on the shoulders of everybody else. That's an idea also that I have in terms of the collage, is that this collage is like this sort of sedimentation rock. In other words, the reason why I also have hundreds of years in there is because I believe that I am the end product of hundreds of years of other people's study. So like I've appropriated the entire body of of psychiatry that's hundreds of years before me. So I'm sort of standing on top of that. So that's one of, so I also, I'm not saying that I'm the only person that's ever thought about the idea that thinking of the mind in layers. So has anybody ever heard of this before, Freud's topographical model of the mind? Does anybody want to take a stab at it and say what it is? Whenever you shake your head, that means yes. No? You want to say what Freud's topographical model? No. Say it again? Say it again? Graph. It could be graphed. So it's like an iceberg, basically. It's supposed to look like an iceberg, and basically at the top of it is what Freud called the conscious level, and that's things that we're conscious of. What he called the middle level is called the pre-conscious level, and those were things that are accessible but not in consciousness. So the way to get to the pre-conscious would be like through dreams or fantasies, memories, right? And then basically they pierce through, but what we're looking at is we're just looking at just the peak of mental life in the consciousness, and the pre-consciousness is this model, and then the unconscious level, you can see Freud believed in like violent motives, unacceptable sexual desires, fears, irrational wishes. So what Freud believed was that basically that this part was like pushing up, and that what you see in this part is a manifestation of what's going on in this part. That's sort of like but really I'm just showing you that Freud, that I'm not the first person to think of the idea and that basically that the idea of thinking of the mind in a visual way is something that I sort of adopted. I appropriated that idea, like how can I think of the world in a visual way, or how memory in a visual way. So this is another thing that you guys might be interested in, and I think it's worth looking up just because I consider myself a developmental psychiatrist. I believe in development. I think that's a really interesting way of thinking of things. It's not surprising because all my everything for me is layers, so basically, development is about layers, and this is called Maslow's hierarchy. Has anybody ever heard of this before? So what Maslow's hierarchy is basically, it's a hierarchy of needs. So basically at the bottom is physiological need, which would be like food, sleep, and then you go up to safety, which would be shelter, then love, belonging, then esteem, then self-actualization. And what Maslow thought was that we pass through each one of these things on a sort of a road to self-actualization, sort of like the chakras a little bit, but now we believe that they're more blended, like a collage, just like the way that you see, that this layer would go here, this layer. In other words, they would be more swirled. It would become more like sort of, multi-dimensional. And then this slide is just basically, again, like psychopharmacologists, so the medication doctors. I have a medical degree, so I'm familiar with medication. You see that this is another visual representation of a synapse. A synapse is a neuron, and the way that two neurons communicate with each other. So I could get into the mechanism of action of antidepressants, but all I want to show you is that many people in the field of psychiatry are thinking about visual representations of things that are obviously that you can't see. So one of my points is that basically that the narrative emerges from the arrangement of the parts. And that basically, so if you guys just for a second look at your narrative, that what you had written in the first few minutes of the talk. And then just notice whether or not you think that there's any sequence and whether or not the way that you sequenced it tells a particular story. And even just think about whether or not if you had sequenced it in another way, whether or not it would tell a different story, and what story would that be? Like many people probably started off with where they were born or something like that. But what if you put that at the end of the story? How does that affect the story? And that's what I'm playing with a lot with the collage idea, is that basically I say, what if I put this next to this? Now I'm not doing completely chaotic by saying like, what if I put this? I'm actually saying like, I'm saying this is what our minds do, is they put these things next to each other and they put them in a particular sequence. And often the story is the same over and over and over again. In other words, the story that we put together all the information in the same way to tell the same story. So you'd think, well, is there a coincidence that I'm constantly telling myself the same story? Well, the answer is no. There's not a coincidence, because human beings are, basically we like patterns. So we tend to sequentially put things in a particular way. And what I'm saying is this is like, what if we put it together in another way? What effect does that have on us? People getting this? Yeah? Comments? Yeah.
It makes me think of recent films of the past few years that have used, instead of making a story in a linear way, that they jump from one time backwards, and then all of a sudden you're in the present, and then you're going back and forth, not just to the past, but like jumping around, so it almost becomes confusing. So I think that's an interesting way when people think about filmmaking and also about collage, that they're rearranging the story, but not necessarily the way we always think of telling a story.
And what about the effect of the internet, right? And about the fact that basically that seeing stories presented in that particular way, right, with clicks and buttons, and what effect does that have on our mind too, right? In other words, is that film that you're describing, is that like sort of a commentary on the way that people's minds are working in the digital age? Well, I do believe that the way that we are looking and consuming media is affecting the way we are remembering things, because there are like these tools that we never had before, like fast forward, you can think of a lot of different, I'm not. Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah.
I think it's really interesting also to see the different elements that are helping you as a person determine in which order to put the parts. So when you asked me to look back at my piece of paper now, I was thinking about why I put things in certain ways and how I have been trained in my brain, like over time, how those, I don't know how to say, like pathways between two thought processes or memories have been shaped, and what were the things that made me think I shouldn't go from this memory to this memory, I should go from this memory to this memory. So it's interesting to see how our experience of the world would shape how those paths are created.
Huge point, really good point. So the good point is, so it's we learn how to put together the parts in a particular way, right? We learn that. Now, we're not going to get too psychoanalytical, but obviously we learn that based on what culture tells us and what our parents tell us. There's a variety of different factors which tell us how to, and sometimes we put the story together in a particular way because that's our experience. So an example that I come up with is like, if in your early life everything went wrong, everything that was going right went wrong, then the way you're going to put together your story is that it was going right and then it went wrong. Because that's your life's experience. Because we learn from what we've experienced. We learn from what we've been told, and we learn from what we know. So one of the things I used to say when I was seeing patients is I used to say, you have a history that's extraordinarily full of adversity. In other words, the amount of adversity that you experienced early in life is much greater than you can't use the same sort of sequence building for the rest of your life than if you use your childhood as a sort of as a template. Does this make sense? Excellent point. Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah, so I guess the suggestion, what I'm taking from that is, and to your point actually, we start with one narrative, right? And whatever that is, sort of a subconscious narrative, maybe based on memories, or not really consciously controlling that necessarily. But with this idea, I'm guessing the suggestion is to then take that and consciously rearrange it so you're creating a different narrative. Is that like?
Or at the very least, appreciating this sort of an idea. This is the same size as this.
Yeah.
They're the same.
Yeah, but the
The illusion is that this one looks smaller than this. So relativism, right? So basically when you place something next to something else, it looks different. I mean, I'm playing with that left and right. You know, I'm basically showing that when you put this next to this, the original thing looks completely different. So what's the application for your life? Well, if I put exercise in my life and I put it next to this, you know, even though it's not what I think I should be doing, I know it's something that would be helpful to me. What does the rest of my life look like? In other words, since it will look as different as this looks to this, because these look different. To me, they do. I'm not great with, like, you know, being able to, I'm the one who goes up to those optical illusion, even though all my work has to do with optical illusion. So back to your part, David, it's not necessarily that you can consciously rearrange the parts, but having an awareness in and of itself, I believe, that the parts are arranged in a way that's personal to you might help you to think, what's another way I could arrange the parts, or how can I think of this differently? And so what we do in psychotherapy is we find lots of patterns for people, and we say, like, well, you tend to arrange the parts this way. We call it, I did this therapy, it's called schema therapy. You tend to arrange the parts in a way where it always makes you look like an outsider. You've told me that story 150 times, right? And I empathize with you, and I understand why you said that, but is there another way of looking at that story? Because basically, then it becomes what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. So basically, if every story becomes that story, then we, in schema therapy, we say we push it into place. In other words, we make it that story if it isn't that story. So rather than saying you can consciously move the parts around, I'd say it's possible to move the parts around, but an awareness that the parts could be moved around and often should be moved around, I think in and of itself is useful. Does that make sense? Any associations? So this is an example of the Ebbinghaus illusion as far as I'm concerned. This I'd say is cubism, because basically I say that you see, remember how Picasso like sort of twisted the body in such a way. For years I was like, I didn't understand Picasso at all. I was like, what is that? And then basically then I finally got to a point where I was like, oh, you mean, oh, so that could be a chair leg, or maybe the image is moving. Maybe that's why it looks the way it does. Or maybe he stretched it and pushed it. And so anyway, that's an example of this. People say, oh, her proportions are perfect. The reason I love the salon is because her proportions are perfect. And I'm like, her proportions are perfect. I mean, her legs are like, you know, I think that's the Ebbinghaus illusion. In other words, basically the people see it and they say, that looks, what an outfit. You know what I mean? I'm like thinking to myself, well, you know, like we'd have to break her in. But the point is that I'm trying to demonstrate that basically that, to your point, which is that we see basically, now we've come full circle, is that we see what we want to see. We wanted to see that circle as smaller. All right, so feelings affect the arrangement of the parts. So when we're feeling down, right, basically, so the reason I took you through that relaxation exercise was because I want you to think now that if you just heard bad news, right, would the arrangement of that life, those fragments, would they be different? Would you include some? Would you not include some? How would you do it based on the way that you feel? Are people registering what I mean by that? So this is a movie that basically I think everybody should see, because basically it's the personification of the feelings, and it shows you basically that when the feelings, it's about a little girl, and these are the different sort of feeling states in her mind, and one of the things that happens is that her mind gets hijacked by the anger. Her mind gets hijacked by fear, gets hijacked by sadness, and then you see how the way she interprets everything around her is so different based on the feeling state. I think it's a really good example of this cognitive behavioral principle, which I might have said, I don't know, maybe 10,000 times, that basically the way we feel affects the way we think. And I believe the way we feel affects the way we remember. So when you're really basically down about something, and you're taking stock of your life and you're saying, just realize that basically that history that you're making is very influenced by the way that you feel in that moment. So Freud used to say, don't make any decisions within 6 months of your psychoanalysis. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but basically the point was that he was like, you're going to go through the ringer in this treatment. So, like just hold your horses and just basically like observe. Because, Freud didn't do that, but anyway, that's a whole nother thing. So this is an example of basically, I call this Last Sunday at Our Place, and this is basically like an idea of like, this is about excitement for me. Like, it's like, I'm really nostalgic for Spain all the time, and I'm actually applying for Spanish citizenship, and I'm close along, I'm along that continuum. I want to be able to live and work in Spain. And this is sort of like my tale of Spain. The way I put these things together, there's like so much going on, and like, I don't really even know if that's true or not. But my feeling is that there's just, there's like sparkling, and then here's another example of basically the idea that the parts arrange based on the way that you feel. Now this one I used to think was about like spontaneity and self-expression, and about like, that expression of like, sort of like that nobody's watching. But then I realized like, he's watching, she's watching, she's watching, even the Virgin Mary is watching. So like everybody's watching this character. Which is an interesting idea, because basically what I try to think about is basically with my collages, I try to zoom out, especially with my newer work, zoom out, zoom out, zoom out, zoom out. Because like even within a memory, somebody could be observing you, you could be observing them. I'll show you more examples of that. So that's the idea, that point of view is very important. So the vantage point that you have is really important. So not just the mood state, but your point of view. Like whether or not you're judging it, whether or not you're putting a value judgment on it, basically like this isn't right, this shouldn't be happening. Those are all points of view, right? So then we get to my favorite painter, Velázquez, and he basically, I feel like we have a lot in common with, again, I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of, but the idea behind here is that there's a particular point of view that's made this particular painting like a fascination for centuries. And basically it's about sort of the perspective and the composition. Notice that the king and queen of Spain are in the mirror. They're supposed to be here. Go ahead.
I know that there is a version of this painting for virtual reality. You can wear the glasses, the headset. You can go inside this scene and look around the little girl. Remember.
Exactly. So I'm saying that it's like a virtual, so that's what I'm saying when I said that basically that you can navigate a memory, right? So we're navigating through all these perspectives, right? And this one happens to have a lot of different nooks and crannies and basically places to be able to navigate. The other thing about Velázquez is that basically this is a collage. This scene did not exist. Most theories about it are that he put these elements together to symbolize something. You could say that about many classical paintings, but this happens to be a super special one. And then this one was appropriated 1 million times over. So since I'm like the, really celebrator of appropriation, that basically that I think it's no coincidence that I love this painting, and that Picasso took Las Meninas and he made various versions of it as well, cubist versions and stuff like that. You'll see that there's many, many different, this is probably like one of the more appropriated paintings. So this is about the idea that perspective is everything. Notice that she's watching the scene, right? That basically that there's this, remember you can navigate it, that it's made up of these fragments. They come together, they feel like sort of a cohesive whole. I say this has like a fishbowl effect. Now there's a concept in psychology which we call observing ego. Observing ego is the ability to neutrally observe your mental life from the outside. Say like, instead of saying like, why did I say that? I'm such a jerk, to say, why did I say that? Basically, it's just the idea that you can observe your own behavior from the outside. I say that my work looks like a diorama. People know what a diorama is? It's like a shoebox that has like a scene in it. And children are encouraged to do that. I think that might be sort of maybe a projection of something. In other words, to see like a stage set. It's sort of like a stage set. So, and I get more and more layers. And if I add a layer here, people say, oh, Steve, don't give away any of your tricks. And then I said that to somebody, they said, Steve, don't give away any of your tricks. Anyway, but the point is that I added a layer here which added a whole dimension backward so that basically it looks like you can go deep, deep in. But it's an analogy for the way that, the way that you might navigate a dream. Both a dream and a memory. Now, what is the difference between a dream and a memory? That was like a Freudian slip. So my idea is that there's a lot of continuum. There's a lot of continuity between dreams and memories, and that we do incorporate aspects of our dreams into our memories. And I think to myself, did I dream that, or did that really happen? And, I don't think we can ever tell, we don't really know. So I would say, again, it's like, have a little bit of humility about your memories. In other words, your memories are not 100% truths. That's one of the things I used to say often, is that memories are not objective truths. They're these dynamic structures that are made of fragments that have multiple time periods existing at the same time. They're condensed and they're compressed and they're expanded, and they're based on the way that we feel, and every time we retrieve a memory, we change it somehow. Now, that's one of the concepts in psychotherapy, is that if somebody is to retrieve their memories in a condition where they feel accepted and non-judged and protected and safe, that actually that changes the memory, makes the person feel safer. Go ahead. Well, the dream is happening in sleep, right? And the memory is happening in waking life. But dreams are a way of memory consolidation. So dreams and memories are related to each other, because one of the things we think about dreams is that they're a way of consolidating and organizing memories. Just like my collage table. In fact, basically, if you think about the way that I'm doing all this stuff, that's like what I'm doing when I'm sleeping. And actually, back to your question, when I'm putting together the scenes, it's almost unconscious. I know what I'm doing, basically, but I'm in this sort of almost like meditative state where I just follow from one thing to the next. It just sort of comes together, and then at the end I have this wow, but I, you know what I mean? It's like sort of semi-between. Any thoughts? So this is another example of now this is a little bit more surreal for sure, right? So what's the difference between what I call semi-realism and surrealism? Well, I'm saying that dreams and memories are sort of surreal in their qualities. People say, oh, that's basically, this is the story of what's between the ears. It has the perspective, most of my work has the perspective of looking deeper inward, inviting you in to basically go around corners with some sort of a suggestion. All right, so we've already covered this, but basically, and I'm glad we've covered it in a sort of an experiential way, but basically, so psychotherapy and memories transcend timelines. Do people have questions about that? Do people understand what I mean by that? They become compressed and condensed, such that when we think we're talking about a memory, like of our 15-year-old self, what if we say tell me a memory about, or tell me the story of your 15-year-old self. You're going to condense it, and you might actually take some of your 13-year-old self. You might take some of your 26-year-old self. You might actually take some of your mother's experience. You might take some of your father's experience. You might take something that you looked in a photograph. You might take something that you heard. You might take a song. You're going to put all these things together, and they're going to transcend timelines. They're going to have representations of other timelines at the same time. The past and the present can occur simultaneously. That is the way I believe it, that basically that the past is always existing at the same time as the present. That memories are full of symbolism. So for example, people say to me why is there a giraffe there? And I'm thinking to myself, well, remember Animal Farm? How basically personifications. So people do have, Freud called it transference, but we do have transference toward other living beings where they become the embodiment of people. Appropriated parts are blended in. So that's what I'm really fascinated in. I say in an age of countless exposure to images, digital images, how is that affecting our memories? What are we blending in as ours? Can we even tell what's the difference between what's ours, what we saw on Facebook, basically what we saw video of? And the quality of the video and the photography is so high now. It's I think everything is virtual reality. It's how does the brain we're not meant, I don't know if we're not meant to, but there's never been a time in history where we've been exposed to the number of different images. How do we archive those? Emotion is a powerful organizing principle, and memories get rearranged. All right, so this title is like, it's called Who's That Sitting Next to Auntie Rose? So my aunt, she sees this collage. My mom shows her this collage. And my aunt goes, she's looking at, she's like, oh, that's Auntie Rose. She's like, who's that sitting next to Auntie Rose? It's like, well, that's somebody from the 16th century. So, I mean, so but the idea here is that basically is that, you know, like, it was almost seamless. She couldn't really even tell the difference between, like, you know, the current image. She thought it was like and I think that we go around through life, you know, and somebody at this party might as well be from the 16th century. We do have people that embody, you know, like basically older ideologies, you know, so basically there is the representation of like, and what's the representation of the bear? Well, you know, there certainly have been people that you think of that could fit the bill, right? Maybe this is the toast and the guy's just up there like, you know, like a bear, just, you know, like just steamrolling through, like, hopefully that's not me, maybe I'm. Anyway, you see also that they're navigable, that's my idea, and that basically that the perspective is that you look inward. I want you to go into the image. I want you to almost feel, and also the nostalgic feel. Most people have seen a photograph like this before of a table scene at a celebration. All right, so now we get to the big part, okay. Memories are the building blocks of identity. Does anybody know what I mean by that? Anybody want to take a stab at it? They constitute who you are. So basically, if we think of identity as generally just the idea of like, who am I? Basically, we're going to access our memories to basically say, you know, well, I went to Disneyland when I was 6, and then, you know, basically, you know, and then my parents got divorced, and then, you know, and then, but these are all memories, and basically all the memories, you know, make up this idea of what we call identity. So that's why basically psychiatrists are really interested in memory, because at the end of the day, we feel that if you change the memory, you change the identity. And if you change the memory and you change it to a story of like, I persevered, and even though I had like nobody guiding me as a child, I was still able to do this and this and this and this, like, how amazing am I? You know, that's a different way of telling the story, right? So that's basically using the same parts and basically, and then using the same memories and saying like, yeah, I taught myself how to drive, and then I applied, you know, to, you know, my first job by my, whatever it is basically, and then you put all these things together and those make up your identity. So if you change the memories and you make them actually, I say like this, as a cognitive behavioral therapist, I'd say, if you're completely pessimistic, you're going to be wrong. And if you're completely optimistic, you're going to be wrong. So why not err on the side of being optimistic? That's like some, anyway. So identity is more fluid than we might appreciate. In other words, basically over the course of our lives, we see ourselves differently and we see the past differently. So like when I add a layer, that's the same thing as like when you turn 60 years old and then you look back and you say, oh, well, maybe I was a little bit reckless as a driver. It might change your whole perspective on everything else. So over the lifespan, our perspective, our memories are going to change based on what comes after. New experience changed our perspective on the past, and new perspectives on the past change how we perceive the present. Does that make sense? Does this seem very radical to you guys? Does it seem like things that people have already seen before, have heard before, have read about? Yes? Some of the ideas are familiar? Like the idea of like what are memories, is that sort of trickling into your worlds? What do people think about that idea, about the idea about how media is affecting memory? Anybody have any thoughts about that? Yeah. Can everybody hear him? Can you say this? This is wonderful idea.
Well, yeah, like if you're looking at like a print, then you spend time with it, and you don't have any distractions like on the side, like an advertisement or anything. So now I feel like you just don't spend time enough with the images and the things in front of you because it's so readily available, anywhere, anytime you want. So I feel like that's kind of repressed our memory. Or I feel like I've noticed that myself too. If I try to think back of something, I'll think back and it's kind of cloudy and I don't really remember it, but I'm like, oh, whatever, I can just go back and look on my phone.
I have this idea that I think that we have these external brains and that we basically have relegated a lot of our mental functions to our phones, including remembering. Who remembers, like the signing of the Magna Carta? Teachers don't even want to teach that anymore because you could just find it on Wikipedia. So basically the idea behind like the accessibility of information and the accessibility of imagery as well, I find that basically like if you don't put it on Facebook or on Instagram or whatever, do you remember it? And no, right?
Well, I mean, I do. I feel like a lot of people, and also like with photos too.
So tell us about photos, yeah.
I'm just like yeah, because I mean I see it. I do it myself where we'll be something will be put on the board and we'll all just take our phones out and take a picture of it instead of like writing it down. And when you write it down, you spend more time with it. So we just take a picture of it and we're like, I can go back to that anytime I want. But then because it's so readily available to us, we just don't actually go back to it sometimes, and then it doesn't like stick with us.
Like when we go back to it, basically, since we didn't register it the first time, when we go back to it, it changes the memory and then it becomes imperceptible from a real, like from a memory that, right? In other words, it's like, oh yeah, she was there, oh yeah, he was there, right? And then we put it together, just like I say, we put it together with all the parts. But I'm interested as photographers, what you all think about that, about the idea about like accessibility of imagery or the effect of imagery or any other thoughts about that. Yeah.
Didn't you say that, if someone suggests, they put a suggestion and they just change one small piece of the image or the memory, then it completely changes the perspective or what that memory is, the complete meaning of it. So that one small piece of information, just like a photograph is cut by one angle or a piece of art, completely changes the meaning.
Absolutely,
or the memory.
absolutely.
Would be in the same
So,
thing.
and what do you think about that in terms of implication of your own photography?
I don't know. I think that it's a lot deeper, because subconsciously we, project onto what we see, and then we also, if in doing our art, subconsciously put things that we don't even realize that are maybe deeply rooted in our own memories that we may not be able to consciously bring forward. So it's really interesting. So how do you think in your work part of your own subconscious memories are
Okay, that's a good
revealed
question.
in
I
your
like
own
that.
work?
So people can ask me questions like that too. So, how is it? So basically, when somebody, I sort of psychoanalyze my work, and it isn't until afterwards that I realize really what it's about. I realize like, oh, I was going through that at that time, and that's what that means. But it's just a hypothesis. In other words, I don't start with a concept and say like, this is what I want to illustrate. Since basically what my work is derived from catalogs and magazines and snippets that I've been collecting for like 30 years. Each one of them is sort of infused in some ways with a life experience at the time, like when I collected it. And since it's also like a representation of like, oh, I got that magazine when, like I showed you one earlier, but I found that in a flyer, in Rio on the ground, and basically it's like, well, then I'm incorporating that in. So there's a whole nother, right? There's a whole nother layer on there, which is that the pieces that I use are unconsciously speaking to me. And at the end of the day, they tell me a story. But since I like to tell stories, I've always been like, used to tell stories, like write short stories, and I like to tell stories like at parties and stuff like that. I realize that like the pattern that I fall into is that I tell sort of a nice story, so I think that basically even when it's really rough that but it's not until afterwards that I realize what the pieces are about. But I guess the point that you brought up earlier, which I think is really important, is that as photographers, right, the perspective and the frame that you choose to, the frame that's in there is like it's just as relevant what's in the frame than what's out of the frame, right? It's just as relevant. So, and you might realize over time that you tend to have unconscious or preconscious patterns that cause you to capture things in a particular way, and it might not be until like 10 years later that you realize why that is. I Also, though, always think of it as a hypothesis. In other words, that it's not a theory. I don't say, well, my work is about this, and I say it's a hypothesis, because that could change over time, too. Something could happen like 5 years from now, and I have to be flexible enough to be able to like say, all right, well, I thought of it this way. How am I going to think about it now? Other ideas? Questions? Yes?
It's a short one. Do you ever feel a limit in the frame for your works? So you have talked about the roundness of the space, no? But what about the frame? Why, why to choose a small or a big dimension and of the
So I absolutely
portrait,
feel, I definitely feel the limitation of the frame, because there's always a limitation, right? In other words, basically, no matter how far I zoom out, I haven't zoomed out far enough. So basically, and as you could see, well, let's see if there's another image here. As you can, let me go back. As you can see, I keep on, I guess what happens is this, is that I try to use, this is one thing that, let me go back to here, is that I believe in this concept of using limitations to your benefit. It's like sort of like a psychological idea that I believe in, is that basically we're not limitless, and sometimes if we embrace our limits, essentially something really special can come out of that, right? So basically, so the fact that I could only take it to here, yeah, that was frustrating to me. And that's a limit of the material as well, because basically I'm using all found materials. I'm not printing anything off the internet. So I could maybe print something off the internet that's even huge and bring it out to here, but I'm being limited by the size of the materials that I'm using. So, but I believe that basically that it tells a particular story, and it tells a story basically, I guess, like again, back to the idea that like that I'm making this out of recycling, is that even with something that's limited, I can make something special. Yeah.
Do you ever alter the aspects of the image to suit what you're doing? So, for example, say the suitcases, you found them in, I don't know, a magazine or an image that they were like reflected on the other side, and then you changed it to fit your image. Do you ever do that?
Not yet. Not yet. I've done that basically because sometimes I work off family photographs. So sometimes I make a copy of the family photograph and then I cut that up. Sometimes I use so in that case I do, alter it, but not yet. I'm not going to say I don't do that because, my whole talk is about being flexible and allowing things to, so maybe over time I will do that because I think that that's really interesting, like the idea of a mirror image, right? Or what I've started to do also now is I want to construct a scene where everything is backwards and it's all the back side of the page, and to see whether or not you could decipher the image. In other words, like turn everything here and then basically you'd see the opposite side of the magazine page. See whether or not you could still recognize, you know what I mean? That's more of like a, like a altered reality than a true memory experience. Other ideas, thoughts? Okay, we're coming to the end. So now this is my story. Okay, this is the way I would tell my story, is that I was born in Chicago in 1972. I'm the third of 4 brothers. You could see some other things. I'll just make up some highlights, is that, and these are memories, right? And these are the memories that I sort of like put together to make my life story. So one relevant memory is that I have this memory that I brought my parents this drawing of Mickey Mouse and Goofy, and they were like, I was like really young because I knew that I was living in New Jersey at the time, and we moved from New Jersey when I was like 7, so I pretty much, 7, 8, so I know that it was like around 5, and they said to me, they said, where did you trace this from? And I said, I didn't trace this. And so basically, like, that's my idea that I've been appropriating forever. In other words, I took from my coloring books and I recopied the drawing, and then I put it in some other context. Another thing is that I'm very prone to imaginative play. My stepfather says I could do hard time because I could spend hours and hours and hours with David, my partner who's here. He says to me, he says, I'll just give you a stack of magazines and a scissors and you could pretty much live anywhere. So that's probably true. And I just put these in here because these are part of like David was saying about the negative and the positive and all that stuff. Like my parents' divorce was definitely not a positive aspect of my life, but it's definitely a memory. Now, if there was a point in my life where I might have put that first, and think about how the story would change if I said my parents divorced when I was 8 years old, right? That would be, I would say I did that for a long time. And then I worked in my mother's fashion business as a cutter during summers. So you could see that's where I got the cutting from. They call me Stevie Scissorhands. So, but what a cutter is basically is that you take the fabric, it's on a roll, and you roll it out, and then both people from both ends take the scissors, and then they meet in the middle. And then you take the roll, and you cut it out, and you meet in the middle, and then you like put a pattern for like a sleeve, and then you cut it out. So like I've been cutting forever. You know, I love to cut. Nobody loves to cut more than me. It's like, I say like, you know, I had this kid come to my exhibition in Miami, and he was an art student, and I said to him, I said, you know, we were talking about like different ways of coping, and I was saying, you put a scissors in my hand, and you put a stack of magazines, and I am calm. I mean, I could go through like, you know, basically like, I could go from JFK to O'Hare, you know, but they don't allow you to bring scissors on the plane. You know, if I could say my therapy scissors, but anyway, so, and then so my father was a cardiologist, and I'd say he paved the way toward medicine. In other words, like he was like, Steve, medicine. So in 1992, 1993, I went to Seville. I lived with a family. Like everything, I was just like enveloped by art. Like I went into these like cathedrals, and like my knees were weak, and I was like, I'm home. You know, in America, I was like, everybody was like, Steve, you know, you're too, you know, dramatic. And in Spain, I was like too boring. So basically, in 1997, I did my psychiatry rotation in medical school, and I produced all this art. Like I came home from psychiatry rotation, and I was just like, I need to do this, and I need to do this, and I need to do this. And then basically I thought, oh, well, psychiatry is like literature. You know, it's all about storytelling. So I felt like, so then basically it was like, my brother was like, well, you're artsy and you're intellectual. Psychiatry makes sense. So then I met my partner in 1999. David is here. From 1998 to 2002, I studied at psychiatry at Columbia. That's where I learned psychoanalysis and neurobiology. So I sort of came out with a collage of an understanding of psychiatry. But I didn't learn about cognitive behavioral therapies until like October 1st, 2001, when I joined the Division of Trauma Studies. And so what the therapy that we were doing in that time is we were actually, and I guess this is sort of like the big reveal, is that we were treating people who had suffered from a trauma, and the trauma was sort of in their mind in fragments, and it was like sort of a disorganized, you know, sort of chaotic, made them feel anxious all the time. It was like this swirling, unresolved events. And what we did was I did a therapy that's called prolonged exposure therapy. And basically what you do is the patient will close their eyes, and they'll tell the story of their trauma over and over and over again. And then it tends to organize into place, and it becomes this sequential, it's never a good memory, but it then becomes organized in this cohesive, coherent thing, and everything else gets better. The sleep gets better, the anxiety gets better. Not for everybody, and it's not a treatment for everybody, but that's where I first became really interested in this idea about memory, and about particularly the visual aspects of memory, and how just aiming interventions at the visual aspect of memory helped people. Then I did almost, you know, like 15 years where I was a teacher at Columbia, and I saw a lot of patients, and I did a lot of imagery exercises, a lot of behavioral therapy. And then in 2017, I rearranged the parts. I went from being a psychiatrist and an artist to an artist and a psychiatrist. And this is my life. This is my memory. This is my parents. This is my father. That's my mother. That's my father's identical twin. I call this the parent trap. I feel like this is the most autobiographical of incorporates all those things that I told you about. Like my love of Spain, my Sephardic Jewish heritage, my parents getting married, the trap of it. I suppose that's me. You know, maybe I have a little bit of a, I don't know. You know, we've got the perspectives, you can navigate it. All right, so in summary, what I'm saying are the memories are temporary structures. They have an organization and a sequence and an arrangement that tells a visual story. The visual story is influenced by our feelings and our patterns of making sense of the world. In other words, like we tend to organize the information in the same way. Memories make up the foundation of identity. Okay, and then this is my idea about why we should have flexibility of the brain and we should allow our stories to be rearranged in multiple different ways, is that, so over here is a depressed brain. This is what's called a PET scan. A PET scan shows the electrical and functional activity, not electrical, but actually more the metabolic activity of the brain. It shows how much of the brain is working. So the lit up portion shows more activity. If you could see the depressed brain, if anybody has, knows anything about depression, depression often is the same thought over and over again. We call that perseveration. So there's not a lot of activity. There's not a lot of sort of pinball activity of multiple, many, many things going on at the same time. It tends to be the same thing. And then the non-depressed brain, this is actually a scan of basically somebody who's before treatment and after treatment. So it shows you that basically that like rearranging things and getting things to move around is good. And that idea is called neuroplasticity, which basically says that if you allow new pathways, it grows new brain. That makes sense, right? If you allow associations between different parts of the brain to sort of open up, the brain sort of opens up. Flexibility of mental processes is associated with emotional resilience. Emotional resilience leads to learning, and learning leads to greater adaptation to new and complicated situations. I'm not saying that this is easy by any stretch of the imagination. Go ahead.
Is like treatment, like by just like talking to your therapist?
Both.
What do you think like the best way is to get someone who is in like a depression to talk to somebody if they're stubborn about not doing it?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So, like how to engage somebody?
Like if you've like brought up the point about talking to a therapist, talking to a psychiatrist, and the person is just like stubborn and not wanting to like seek help or try and talk to somebody. What do you think the best way to like get to like encourage that person to do it?
Well, I'm hoping that as I talk about these concepts and I basically show that, like the psychology of collage, that people that may be hesitant to see a psychiatrist realize that we think about some really interesting things and what we think about makes sense. So I'm hoping that like a talk like this will end up somewhere in some public forum and will help greater society at large to show like, sort of like, this is what, I could talk to somebody like Steve, and I could talk to him, and some of these ideas make sense to me. I believe actually that education probably, I guess that's a better, more refined answer, is that education about the brain, I think in and of itself is therapeutic, and then it helps people to feel more curious. I don't know if people after this talk feel more curious to learn more about, hopefully they do. So we'll just end with an image, and then basically this is called Nana's office, and basically I say if Nana had an office, this is what it would look like. And it's basically supposed to be like an enveloping, sort of nurturing place. Any more thoughts, comments, questions, feedback? Yeah.
Do you think that, I don't know if this is true, but it looks like to some extent your collages are some kind of form of therapy for you and ways of understanding. So do you think that it could be a form of therapy for people to create collages in a similar way that, could creating collages like this of their own life become a form of therapy?
I do. I think that basically that, and I like your provisional statement, which is basically, do I think that it could be? The ideas dovetail a lot with what I've learned in terms of other types of therapy. And it's, so I could foresee a time in which basically, potentially, people could use collage as a, like more of as an assistive tool or an adjunctive tool that people could bring in, because I do believe in like certain drama therapies and role playing and art therapy in general, and I think that collage it has a lot of compelling concepts, and that, hopefully, like the idea is that when you experience something that you integrate it in a new way. So I'm hoping that basically these ideas are compelling enough. I had some people come to a talk that I gave in Miami, and the therapist came to me afterwards and he said to me, I'm going to introduce this idea to my patients because I think it's a really interesting framework. I still present it as an artful idea. In other words, at the end of the day, this is artistry. This is either the aesthetics of memory or the optics of memory. So I don't want to go so far as to say that this is a therapeutic tool, but I do believe that it's within the realm of education about psychology, and it could be really helpful. Other questions? Yeah.
Do you think that like collages is a way of therapy, or do you think that like a passion is a way of therapy? Because I feel like if I am down or something, then I'll play like music and stuff, and that'll kind of just completely like wipe my mind away from whatever I was thinking. So do you think that it's more based on like a passion, or based on like or just based on collaging and like mixing all these images together?
All right, so at its most, that's a really good question. At its most basic level, I believe that, well, how would I say it? So as a behavioral therapist, I was constantly devising these behavioral strategies for people to either overcome a phobia or overcome the inertia of basically like feeling too depressed and too down to do anything. So I think that doing something, like for example, having a passion for something in and of itself is therapeutic. Because basically I think that having an intention and then following through with action is therapeutic, no matter what it is. It doesn't have to be collage. Collage is really, I think, the most, as far as I'm like sort of my hypothesis is that it's a very compelling way of understanding memory. And sort of my idea is that if you understand memory, that you might, the applications can, hopefully at some point, like somebody will write to me and say like, I thought about this and I thought about this, and then I'll, to further the discussion. Yeah.
I found a connection between your work and editing, video editing. Yeah, not just for timelines, different timelines, but also the rearrangement of the scenes. Because if you rearrange a movie like Pulp Fiction, is a normal movie, just like two gangsters go to kill somebody, then it's linear. But if you see Pulp Fiction for the first time, it's simply beautiful because it's edited in that way. So I think there is a connection. What do you think?
So I think that I'm a visual storyteller. And so I think video editing is a form of visual storytelling. So I think they are the same. Other people. Yeah.
Think of other tools, like I've used drawing with both hands and writing with both hands because I think it balances the brain. Are there any other tools that you feel are brain balancing that are similar but not the same as something like that?
So when I was telling you all about cutting, right? That when, with the snipping of the images, is that I see that as what we call mindfulness. And mindfulness is like sort of all the rage right now. The idea behind mindfulness is that you don't have to talk about anything. You just have to ground yourself in some way, like Nancy's saying about balancing. So definitely a tool would be like, like it's like a repetitive sort of action that basically it could be sorting, it could be anything that's repetitive that gets you sort of into this zone where you are not preoccupied with anything in the past, not preoccupied with anything in the future, but rather like completely engaged in the task at hand. And people know when they're in that state. So trying to achieve some activity in your life which gives you that flow state, I think is a huge tool, and all of you probably already have that between like, the maybe the methodical setting up of your equipment, or the surveillancing of the scene, or that basically that you're all artists, so all of you have some sort of a mindfulness process, and you probably have parts of your artistic process just like me that are not mindful at all, that like cause you anxiety and like neurosis and panic, but identifying those parts of your your practice and then knowing that those exist. Now, one of the things that is in a therapy that's called DBT is that people will write down things that were on flashcards, and they'll put them like in a shoebox, and it's sort of like a crisis emergency kit. And what they do is basically is they write down like like snipping out magazines, or like like organizing my paints, or and basically when they're sort of feeling in crisis, they go to that box, they take it off the shelf, and they look inside, and basically they remind themselves of those sorts of zone, like getting into the zone like activities. So that is definitely something that I encourage everybody in this room is already probably doing that, but to just recognize that is something that has a powerful way of, because remember, if we go backwards in this equation, and we say that like the way we look inward is really dependent on the way that we feel, then things that are directed just at the way we feel, such as your passion, right, are going to affect the way that you see things, are going to have this sort of domino effect in a positive, we call that a virtuous cycle. Other questions, thoughts, observations?
Just wondering what you feel about the effect of video games, and especially violent video games, because I know some people use those to quote unquote relax, but could it really be relaxing the mind when you're shooting at something?
Okay, so that's a good question. So, all right, so once upon a time I knew this woman who was an education PhD, and she tried to educate me on the virtues of video games. So I stepped back with a little bit of humility by saying, like, you know, well, I've never seen that, but basically, not that I've never seen the virtue of video games before, but so I have keep an open mind in terms of basically like that I don't think that all video games are bad, even the shooting ones. And I'll tell you why I think that the shooting ones are potentially, you know, she was saying that this is in terms of research on the subject matter, is that there's a reason why we watch scary movies. There's a reason why we watch, and it may be this vicarious sort of like working out of something that we can't live through in our own lives. And so there might be a role of this, there probably is some sort of a role of like a vicarious way of basically, in a safe way, discharging aggression that doesn't hurt any other people. Now, whether or not clearly it's a matter of degree, right? So basically, like, there's an excess of that in our society, and that basically that many of the video games are on the extreme in terms of violence. But I guess what I say is I wouldn't throw it out altogether, just because I do believe that there is some value in being able to safely discharge, a lot of that internal angst and aggression. Do you have a question? No. Anybody else? Thank you, everybody, for coming and for participating and listening, and I really appreciate it, and I learned a lot. All excellent questions. So thank you very much.